ahead now. That's it now.
Okay. So you're very welcome tonight to Tras na Tíre. My name is Marcus Howard of Easter Rising Stories, and tonight's talk is with the famous historian Tomás Mac Conmara about the time of the Tans, memory in the Irish War of Independence. Tomás Mac Conmara is an oral historian and author from Tuamgraney in County Clare. He was awarded a PhD at the University of Limerick in 2015 for his exploration of the social memory of the Irish War of Independence. Since he was a teenager, he's been recording the memories of older people, particularly related to the revolutionary period. He has published 6 books, including Days of Hunger, The Clare Volunteers, and the Mountjoy Hunger Strike of 1917, as well as his 20-year oral history collection work, The Time of the Tans, which is excellent. I have it myself. His book, The Scariff Martyrs, is available in September of this year. Tomás, you're very, very welcome back to Tras na Tíre.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Look, I'll probably have the fun, but I'll echo what you said earlier on there. If there's anybody, and I know it's difficult because I'm quite far from a technical expert, but if anybody can, if everybody can mute themselves, it'll make it an awful lot easier. Normally I welcome talk and conversation, but tonight we might try and encourage everybody just to mute themselves if they can, and very much at the later stages of the lecture there'll be plenty of time for talk, and I'll encourage it and welcome it at that point. So listen, thanks a million, Marcus, for the chance to speak with Tras na Tíre. I've spoken before on the Scariff Martyrs, as you say, and it was a great it's a great platform. It's a great work that yourself and Liam and Stephen have been doing. So look, yeah, as you say, tonight I'm going to talk about the memory of the Irish War of Independence, and I suppose just a broad reflection on that in the sense of its value, which of course I argue for, but also all of the different ways that that memory comes to us. And, you know, it's probably obvious to say that, you know, the Irish War of Independence was, you know, certainly one of the most, if not the most significant period in modern Irish history. But it's also, you know, a period of history that relates to probably the most people, and all of the tradition, heritage, history that we have relating to that is hugely important. But it comes in different ways. So part of what I'll hope to do tonight is to discuss in a way the different influences on memory, the different ways in which we have learned about it, and ultimately to tease out the relationship between ourselves as a people and that period in our history, and how that relationship has changed over time, how it's been cultivated, and what is the meaning of all of that? What does it mean for us as historians and as enthusiasts of history, or as scholars, or whatever it might be? Now, straight off the bat, I'm obviously an advocate of oral history. I've been collecting in different ways memory since I was a child, as you mentioned, Marcus. And, you know, obviously it's not just the War of Independence or the revolutionary period I collect, but you know, in almost all of the interviews that I've done, be they about oral tradition generally, or be they about the War of Independence, it's very evident the status and the landmark nature of the Irish War of Independence in the sort of temporal understanding of our history. So I'm going to give examples of the memory that I've recorded, both from my own collections and also from the Cork Folklore Project and from the Military Archives of Ireland. I know that Stephen McOwen, Commandant Stephen McOwen, is there, who was instrumental in getting the Military Archives Oral History Project up and going, and that's still up and going very much. And the McOwen collection, which came into the Military Archives in the last number of years, will feature tonight as well. So I'll be talking about some of the different archives that I've been involved in, but particularly in a sense of how the War of Independence and that period generally keeps popping up. It is stamped on the historical consciousness of the Irish people. And as I said, we'll hopefully tease out the ways in which that actually comes to us within memory. First of all, I also want to mention, you know, I've called it The Time of the Tans, and obviously the book is called The Time of the Tans, but obviously there was far more forces involved in the War of Independence than just the Black and Tans as we technically know them. We had the RIC, we had the auxiliaries, we had the British Army as well, but consistently across hundreds of interviews, older people, particularly those who were children at the time or who grew up in the immediate shadow of it, would almost always refer to it as the time of the tens. And I think it's a very conscious reference. There's often this point made by historians about the inaccuracy of that title. But in actual fact, when you drill down into that, you realize that people are very consciously often describing all of the forces of the crown as tens. When you tease it out, you realize that, of course, they realized that the RIC were there and that they were somewhat distinct. They also recognized the auxiliaries were distinct, and of course, the British Army were too. But they also recognized the allied nature of those forces and the way in which those forces operated together. And so collectively, they've been consciously described as the tens or the black and tens. So, look, I'll start making my way through it, but look, as I said, I've been doing it since I was a child, and I'm still learning. You know, it's funny you mentioned about the PhD there, but like I was never in a better position to do the PhD than when I finished it. You know, and it's one of those things about academic undertakings, or all undertakings really. You're learning all of the time, and my big ambition in history is to develop understanding, and you know. Of course, you have to have knowledge, you have to have methodology, you have to have skills, but unless you understand the history that you're exploring or you're trying to write about, then you ultimately won't be successful. And I think in the context of in the context of understanding the War of Independence, you have to get down to the ground level. You have to be literally in the fields, in the roads, in the streets where it happened. And, you know, if you go there, you'll find the fragments of history. And if you gather them up, you put them together, you build a better understanding of that time. And as I say, that's what I've been trying to do for a lot of years. And I'll continue to try to do that, as many other people have as well. So I'm going to share the presentation now, Marcus, and we'll hopefully be in business. So bear with me. Now, is that up?
Yeah, it is. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So what I want to do first of all, obviously I'm from County Clare. A lot of my research has happened in Clare, and I'll be making, you know, a fairly heavy reference. And of course, it is the centre of the known universe as well. So you'll understand if I talk a lot about County Clare tonight. But obviously, memory is national. It's international. But I wanted to draw attention to this piece of audio because an awful lot of what I think we should be doing as historians is trying to get to the human understanding of the historical experience. And that takes us away from the political, and it takes us away even from the military aspects. But I think it does build a better understanding. And what we're looking at here, of course, is James Connolly with his young family in the late 1800s, and his daughter, Nora Connolly, in old age on the right-hand side. But in the Unchan MacOwen collection, Unchan MacOwen was a Republican and a historian who in the 1970s and 80s began recording memories of former Republicans, both from the 20s and from the 30s and 40s period, published a number of books. But in 2017, I think it was, Stephen MacOwen there as well, was the first to have contact with Unchan's son. And eventually that material was deposited within the military archives. Daniel Iotis, the current OC of the military archives, continued to do great work on that. And I was very, very fortunate to be commissioned to undertake a review of all the interviews. And one of the interviews I listened to was with Nora Connolly O'Brien. I'm going to play this clip now. It's Nora talking about the early 1900s, so not too far after that picture was taken. And she's talking about being at home. She describes, you know, subtly enough, but describes the poverty that her family, her mother Lily, lived in, and her family generally, and also talks about her dad being in America at the time, where he was fighting for socialism as he had done all his life, and just the sense of a child wondering, will her father be home? So I'll play that clip now. I would encourage you all to turn up your audio so that you can make sure you can hear it well enough. So it is fairly audible anyway.
At Christmas time, I remember her coming in one day. Father was in the States at the time, and he said he thought he'd be home for Christmas. And Mama came in from her shopping and had several sheets of tissue paper with her, blue and red and yellow and green. And she cut them up all at a certain length and a certain size. And she said, no, we'll make change, we'll have the place changed and very bright for Daddy coming home. So it all depended on her making a home. Pork was cheap in those days. She got half a leg of pork for her Christmas dinner. And she had made a plum pudding. She had made it on early on in the day, and she made when she had it all mixed up, she said, come now, you must all stir this and make a wish. So we all stirred it and made a wish and kept very secretive about her wish, except I said to Mona, I wish Daddy'd be home. She said, I did too. Christmas Eve came and their stockings were hung up on the mantelpiece and Daddy hadn't arrived home.
So, as I say there, that's a very short piece of memory, but it does take us to the heart of the human experience behind, who is obviously one of the most famous characters in Irish history, but also in global socialist or revolutionary history, certainly. And I think, again, as I said, that assists us in developing a deeper understanding of our general, of the broader experience. So I'm going to move on, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, because if you're trying to explore memory of a period from 1916 through to 1923, then you have to understand the cultural background, that follows. And it's absolutely essential, in my view, to understand what happens in the decades beforehand, what builds the consciousness within which that period sits, in order to understand what happened during that time. And we've this often repeated quote of Padraig Pearse, they have left us our Feeney and dead. But what does that really mean for us in the context of the War of Independence, the whole historical consciousness of that? I think it's absolutely critical to what happens during that time. And I'll give one very quick example of it. This is a memorial to a man called Michael Slattery. It's in Feakle in East Clare. And as you can see there, he died in 1875 at the age of 29. And this monument was put up to his memory in 1881. Now, he was a member of the Fenians in Feakle in 1865 and in 1866. He was arrested, he was treated very badly in jail and died very young, as you can see from his age there. So in 1866, he's active in the Fenians in Feakle in East Clare. 50 years later, his nephew, a man called Jimmy Slattery, is in Jacob's Biscuit Factory in Dublin in the outbreak of the Easter Rising of 1916. He goes on to become one of the most significant IRA men during the War of Independence in Dublin and a member of Michael Collins's famous squad. So there you have somebody who is directly linked to somebody who was active in previous generations. And of course, this happens across the country, but the very direct link to the Fenian movement, the memorialization of that person and the follow through of his nephew to be one of the most active Republicans during the revolutionary period is certainly notable. To draw a connection between that forward, this is of course Lord French, who was a significant British figure during the War of Independence, one of the most significant and early enough ambushes that took place was in December 1919 in Ashtown in Dublin, when they attacked cars, one of which was carrying Lord French. And of course, Jimmy Slattery was involved in that. You can see him there on the right-hand side of that photograph. And also Keogh, his comrade Keogh was there as well. And that was, of course, the incident which led to the death of Martin Savage. But those two men, subsequent to that, came down to East Clare, to Jimmy's native home, and spent time in Bodyke on the run after that ambush. But, it's funny the way things always connect up, but close to where they were on the run, where they were staying at that time, was a man called Joe McAvoy. And John Fahey, who's there listening, and his daughter Miriam, you will know that Joe McAvoy was the driver of the boat on which the Scariff martyrs were taken from Williamstown to Killaloe. Now, Joe's son was the driver of Lord French's car. So the two men who had come down after attacking Lord French's car were spending time on the run close to the father of the man whose son was driving the car. So these connections are often, as I say, become apparent after a bit of time when you put things together. But the evictions, I believe, in the land war are absolutely critical to the consciousness during the revolutionary period. And I just have one example. There are, of course, multiple examples, but in Clare and across the country, there were significant evictions that took place. But in West Clare, in a place called Kilrush, the Vandeleur evictions in 1888 were really quite significant. And this builds a sort of a deep memory, which is connected inextricably to the feelings and the emotions of the revolutionary period. So the photograph you're looking at here is a photograph of the Birmingham house in Moyasta in West Clare. And the eviction, of course, is taking place with the battering ram, etc. Now, I was fortunate enough to interview over a number of years Matthew Birmingham, who was the grandson of the owner of that house, and whose father, Tom Birmingham, who you see on the left-hand side there, was actually inside in the house that day when the battering ram was outside. His father was a 15-year-old boy at the time, and whose job it was, as you'll hear shortly, was to stoop the boiling porridge in order to prepare it into syringes to squirt it out at the emergency men and RIC who were outside trying to beat in their wall. Now, throughout the little short piece of memory I'll play from Matthew, you will see another image of the eviction scene, and there'll an arrow come up which will point at steam, that you will actually see steam coming out of the house in the image. And remember, when you see that the steam coming out of the house is from the fire, from the gruel that is being stirred by this man's father, who you see on the left-hand side. He starts off by telling a little humorous example of how one man in the area managed to subvert the attempts of the emergency men to evict him. Look at that.
I could tell you a story about one man. He got a brainwave. He put his mother into bed and waked her when they came. And he had he wasn't shot to cool doggies then at that period. The house was full of women, and they only stood in the door and went away.
Matt, your grandfather, who was also Matt, and your father Tom were both, as you say, evicted. Can you talk to me about their involvement in the actual eviction itself?
Oh yes, when the battering ram was coming along, they lit a big fire above here near where the quarry is. And the horses wouldn't go down. They were burning for about 5 or 6 hours. They had to go back to the next road and come over the shore, which they did. But the position of the house at the shore was up, of course, naturally, up big fallout, rough stones and all. And every time they went to put up the tripod, a squirt of porridge came out from the house. My grandfather was inside, and my father was doing the stoking, boiling light porridge, so some meal run through water on it, boiling. And they had every utensil in the area gathered in to hold boiling water. And the only instruction my dad got was to be sure and keep the fire going and keep the pots boiling. And when they knocked the wall, he was to run for all the utensils that had been left and turn them over. For fear the emergency would use the hot water to scald them.
So there's Matthew, drawing a connection between, for those 2021 and 1888, 133 years ago. And, I would have interviewed Matthew back in about 2012. And again, that was, 125 odd years where there was a living connection between him, his father and his grandfather, and the steam that you're seeing coming out of that house in the photograph in front of you. Which again is when I think of the really beautiful things about memory, is that within the oral tradition, how you can reach so far back into the history of our into our past and get a real sense of that experience through that memory. So look, moving on quickly again towards the War of Independence itself, it's important to mention 1917 because, although it's like a valley of history in many ways nationally, in that, the 1916 Rising is important, and then we jump to the War of Independence. But 1917 was really, really important, both in terms of the political mobilization of Sinn Féin, and then also the death of Tomás in September 1917 on hunger strike. And it's my view that death, I've made this suggestion before, that it's actually more important than the Easter Rising in the context of Irish Irish political consciousness, because you have a people who are now very much aware of Irish Republican separatism, which they weren't really at a public level in 1916. And now, a year and a half after that rising, you have a young man dying on hunger strike, which is unlike any other death, as you know, as we know from across all epochs of Irish history. It has a bigger impact than most, certainly, other deaths. So 1917 is important to mention it, even though at a local level it doesn't really feature within the memory. It has a massive significance. Just want to draw attention again then to some big issues that play out in the memory, because they play out in the experience of that time. And obviously the RIC, their presence, their role, their experience is absolutely critical to all of this. And I've spoken to many people whose parents or grandparents were in the RIC and tried to document that experience. It's not as readily available as other forms of tradition, but it's there and it can certainly be found if you try and find it. But the experience for the RIC was obviously hugely transformative, and illustrated here by two examples. In May 1917, an RIC county inspector refers to County Clare as the county is quiet, and a couple of months later he's making the following declaration that Sinn Féin is the law of the land. Now that's only in 1917. We know that in 1919, in April of 1919, there's a boycott nationally called and is implemented largely across the country, and we see that followed up with increasing attacks on RIC barracks in outlying areas. So there is very much a dynamic between the Irish Republican movement, its supporters, and the RIC. And we gradually see the ground shifting from under the RIC during that period. And that's played out in memory as much as it is within the experience. But we can't underestimate the level of transformation that took place from the point of view of politics, from the point of view of the judiciary, from the point of view of the broader social and economic system during this time is absolutely colossal, and all of that affects the general population. Now, when we move into 1920, we begin then to see the real violence, I suppose, that began to characterize the War of Independence. And it's really important for us to accept, one thing, that the War of Independence was unlike any other kind of a war in the context of how it manifested, the local experience of it, the way in which the Republican movement was established according to the existing cultural and geographic boundaries, brought about a dynamic linked to the identity of people, the connection to place. And that was really important both for activists, but also really, really important in the context of how the memory formed and how that memory endured. But when we see the Black and Tans being introduced to the conflict in 1920, we see a different dynamic. Of course, it has been bitter. Of course, it has been violent up until that. But now you have a very, not exclusively British force, but a very explicitly British force involved in the conflict. And of course, their behavior is well documented. But what's really critical here is that the experience of the War of Independence, as it ratchets up, affects almost all the population, or certainly all the population within the active areas. Now, irrespective of if you are a member of the IRA, if your family is connected to the IRA, if there's IRA within your community, you're going to experience the War of Independence in some way. So it brings the passive, it brings the active together within this sort of vortex of experience. And that means that we have then, in the decades that follow, a really broad and diffuse community memory. So that gives us a richness in terms of exploring that experience. But we have to understand the distinctions in terms of what that experience actually was for the different people. The next piece of audio I'm going to play for you now comes from the Cork Folklore Project, from a lady called Mary O'Donovan, who was interviewed in 1996. Now, it's a life story interview. It's not focused on the War of Independence, but in the interview, Mary is asked about the Black and Tans. And as you will hear, she has a very direct link to Tomás McCurtain, who, as we know, was murdered by the RIC in March 1920 in his home in Blackpool in Cork. This is a photograph taken only a week beforehand, where he is throwing in the ball at a football match between Cork and Clare. And as I say, a week later, he's killed in front of his wife, Eilish, and his young family as well. So we'll play the piece of audio. And as I said, it's Mary O'Donovan talking about the evening that Tomás McCurtain was killed. And the last time that she saw him would have been very, very close, at least hours before he was killed. So we'll play it now. It's only, again, about a minute and a half long.
And can you tell me some things about the Black and Tans, what they did?
Oh, don't be talking, girl. They done terrible things. First of all, you know, they shot Tomás McCurtain.
Right.
You know that, don't you?
I do.
Yeah. I was working with him at the time. And that night, he was in the shop selling flour and meal himself inside the counter. And I was just like in the month of March, you know. And I was going out. It was kind of getting dull and it was misty. And I was going out. The factory was at the back of the shop at Hodgson. And I was going out anyway. I was finishing off an order or something myself. And I was going out. And this man was singing outside the shop door. Better to do around that time, you know, now. And I was going out the door. And Tomás, there are some mercy in him now. He called me back. And he said, give that to the poor fellow sing outside the door. I know there was 6 or a shilling he gave me now. He gave me something to hand it to the poor singer outside the door. And I did, you know, now. And he was singing, left the green flag around me, boys. That's the song he was singing.
Right.
He was singing that song, but I handed him that nigger outside the door. It was quite a coincidence, wasn't it? It was during the night. That night he was murdered. His wife was expecting a baby, so she had twins after.
So that was Mary again, and just the latter part of that audio is a little bit difficult to hear, but just to just summarise, she's describing the evening that McCurtain is shot. She's explaining that there was a ballad singer singing "Wrap the Green Flag Around Me." Tomás comes back, gives her a shilling or half crown or something to give to the ballad singer. She does that. She turns back and sees Tomás walking away, and that's the last time she sees Tomás. Now that little piece of memory, I believe, is very powerful, but it only showed itself by chance within the interview when the person interviewing her asked that general question to remember the time of the Black and Tans. So again, another example of the opportunities that are there. I just wanted to show this image. I'm not going to play the audio because I know I'm conscious of time, but this is an image of Francie Kennelly. And Francie was born in 1917 and was one of the best storytellers I ever recorded. Now, I say storyteller in this thing. I believe all of these people are storytellers in their own way. But Francie was an actual practiced storyteller. He used to do it. He was on the Pure Drop on RT television back in the 90s, and he was a really remarkable storyteller. But poor Francie passed away just in the last week at the age of 103. And I just wanted to mention him tonight because, you know, Francie had great tradition on the War of Independence, but he had this mixture between the craft and the story he was actually telling, because, you know, some storytellers are brilliant tellers and they repeat the stories that they're good at, but you could bring up any aspect of tradition, including the War of Independence, and Francie could tell those stories with great insight, but also with great skill as a storyteller. So I just wanted to acknowledge Francie tonight. I had great pleasure in recording him many times at his home over the years. And I had great pleasure too in recording this woman, Catherine Talty. And I want to put on the slideshow for a second there again, if that's all right, just to do this, to illustrate the value of Catherine. Should have done this the other way around, but anyway, what we're looking at is a letter written in December 1920. And on the top left-hand corner, it was written in Chicago, posted to West Clare. And on the top left-hand corner, you'll see that the person writing the letter is talking about being at Mass the previous day and hearing about the burning of Cork. in December 1920, and how everybody in the church was in tears, etc. And it was a really huge moment in Ireland, but a huge moment for the Irish people living in America at the time as well, and Irish Americans, because the news was coming through, and it was a devastating experience, and the stories coming were devastating as well. But in the bottom right-hand corner of the letter, you'll see that the letter writer says that, Mary, I am sending a little parcel, a little present to the baby, just a little reminder. Remembering this is in December 1920, and the little girl, as you can have probably guessed, was Catherine Maroney at the time, who was 4 years of age in December 1920, and who passed away at the age of 2016. And when she did, she passed away one of the best friends that I will ever have, and was also one of the most remarkable bearers of memory that I'll ever encounter, because she not only had the understanding and the memory of it, the emotion of it, she remembered seeing the black and tans, the emotion of all of that, the fear that kind of surrounded that period, but she also was able to document the way in which the memory was passed on from generation to generation over the 100 years that followed, and all of the ways that it was impacted politically, the economic situation, the development of a state, and an ongoing IRA activity. For example, her husband was an IRA activist in the 1940s, Sean Talty, and is within the collection collected by Untitled Chapter that I mentioned earlier on. And she was able to narrate with great effect the way in which the War of Independence was spoken about over different generations and what was affecting that and changing it as well. So it was a great experience meeting Catherine and meeting people like Catherine right across the country. And, you know, without her inclusion and the inclusion of other people, we don't have a full understanding at all of that time. I've no question, no doubt about that. And mentioning the burning of Cork as well, just in late 2019, I had the pleasure of recording this lady, Joan O'Keefe, who was born on the night Cork was burned. And there's obviously no, you know, historical knowledge comes with that, but there's a great reminder that that period is very, very close to us in terms of our recent history. You know, younger people maybe have a sense that the War of Independence is a period of time, a long time ago, and, you know, it's not. It's within reach of our memory. You know, one generation, in fact, in the case of Joan O'Keefe, but 2 generations for most people. And that's something I think all of us involved in history, the promotion of it, should remember, the way in which memory can form that bridge quite easily back to events of, you know, what's seen or distant past. So I mentioned earlier about the effect of the, I'll go back here, the effect of the raids that, the effect of the broader escalation of the conflict. You had 48,407 raids took place across 1920 alone. Now, in almost all of those raids, the IRA volunteers that they were looking for were not at home, but who were at home were usually mothers, sometimes wives, sometimes sisters, brothers, fathers, who were left behind. And they're the people who often suffered as a result of those raids. But those raids, again, brought more and more people into the conflict, more and more people into the experience of it. For some people, it was an obviously incredibly frightening experience. Some people, it was a fatal experience. Houses were burned. But all of this is not only burning houses, it's burning into the memory and the consciousness of the people generally across the country. So that escalation, the nature of it, again, the fact that, you know, the war is coming to your door, it's coming to your townland, to your village, is a very personal and intimate type of experience. And again, that plays out very powerfully in the memory. I just wanted to give this example of a roundup in Cork of 30 young men. Now that's around 30 young men who are being rounded up. Some are held, some are questioned, some are released. But all of those 30 men have one experience that you're looking at in front of you. And all of that would be retained within their memory. And that's only one snapshot of one experience in one part of the country. This would have been typical of the interruption into daily life that the War of Independence actually represented. And often it was very violent. These experiences were very violent, were very upsetting, obviously, for people. And as I said, fatal in many, many cases as well. In this case, I'm going to play a piece from Michael O'Gorman, a man from Scariff in East Clare, And he talks about his grandfather. And remember, when you're hearing this, his grandfather had been in the British Army in World War One, prior to World War One, and had served in the British Army for many, many years. And his grandfather and his granduncle are returning from fishing and encounter a group of black and tans. The image you're looking at is taken from the same period. It's obviously not the event we're talking about, but it would be characteristic of the experience of that time. So we're going to play Michael O'Gorman talking about an attack on his grandfather and granduncle and the vicious nature of it and the physical legacy that was left in the aftermath of it.
The evening that Helens beat up my grandfather and my granduncle Michael. Michael was his brother-in-law.
That's Michael Young, isn't it?
Michael Young, yeah. When they were coming home, they were coming up the Fecal Road, they're near Michael McMahon's. The tens were actually on their way down the Fecal Road. They struck my grandfather into the face with a butt of a rifle and smashed his jaw. And I hammered him and kicked him while he was on the ground. But Michael tried to help him, and they struck Michael with the butt of a rifle, and when Michael fell, one of them stood, his arm went out like that, and one of them stood on him. It stood on his arm, and another stood on his back. And they got the butt of the rifle, and they smashed his arm again and again and again with the butt of the rifle. And when I was a little lad, I used to spend a lot of my time with my granduncle. I used to notice his arm, even when he hadn't his sleeves turned up, which was like a sickle, like that. The doctors were never able to get his arm straightened out. They were able to save it all right, but they could never get it straight. So that his arm was bent over like a sickle.
So, again, this would be something that, or that type of experience would be repeated right across the country, and obviously an awful lot worse would have happened to people as well. But I think it's an important example in the way that Michael, explains it and describes it, the personal connection to his grandfather, his granduncle, the way he physically saw the legacy of that beating with his granduncle whenever he was working with him as a young man. And also the way it links to place. And that's really, really important that, all of these incidents are invariably linked to a particular place. And that place then takes on a significance. And I know of even one IRA volunteer in Galway who was in his late 70s when the forestry were cutting down or were going to plant a road, an old road that had been fell into disuse. And he stopped it eventually because he was so irate, the fact that he had been arrested and taken away by the Black and Tans on that road that himself and his uncle were building or were developing at the time when he was arrested, was a connection between himself, that period, his own arrest, his own activism in the IRA at the time as well. So the place becomes really significant and bound up with the memory as well. And these memories are actually, I think, very, very well explained by, ironically, Rudolph Fielding, the 9th Earl of Denbigh, who would have been, really tightly bound up with the British Imperial Project. But he wrote, he wrote to the newspapers in 1920 when all of this was taking place and said, as you can see there, what hope is there of peace in Ireland when the whole of Ireland is in this condition and every child goes to bed at night in terror, hearing shots and seeing murders? These ineffaceable and indelible memories will make them enemies of our country for the whole of their lives. I think that was a very powerful prediction. Now, I've met and recorded, obviously, earlier on in my work, many people who were children at the time and who were even teenagers at the time. And there would be, obviously, a residual anger about what happened. I certainly wouldn't suggest that they were bitter or they were enemies of England, but certainly the experience left a legacy, and that was manifest in the way in which they spoke about it. You could hear and sense the feeling and the emotion of the time, and also the sense of grievance that the community must have felt at that time when they were going through that whole period. And I think it'll be kind of fairly well illustrated in this example here from Nora Canavan. I was very fortunate to record Nora back in 2012 And it was actually Francis Madigan, a great friend of mine and a great folklore collector from Innistimon in North Clare, who introduced me to Frances. She broke the ground, she developed a relationship, and I was able to get in then and record Nora. And what I would encourage you here, again, it's about maybe a minute, maybe about 2 minutes. First of all, she talks about the period of the Black and Tans and what it was like. And then she recalls the Monreal ambush, which was December 1920 and happened very, very close to her house. And I would encourage you to listen to her voice, but listen to her breathing almost, because in my view, the conjuring up of that time is manifest in her breathing as much as it is manifest in her words. So this is, I say, Nora Canavan, who died at the age of 108, as you can see there, in 2016. So we'll play the piece from Nora now. Just bear with me. No.
You know, the time of the 10th, it was an awful time. God, you wouldn't know without the night. They'd knock on the door and they'd come in and search your house. And if there was a spark of light seen, the windows had to be barricaded, covered up, no light to be seen. And that by the Murphys we were talking of the last day, that was very sad. Wasn't it sitting down reading a book that he was when he was shot through the window? Oh, God, it took an awful effect on them, it did. My father's health broke down that time. Oh, you'd be afraid of your life, sure. And the 10 or 12 lorries go from Innistimon down to Innis every morning. And they'd be banging shots at both sides. Oh, I remember the evening before we came in from school, I remember my father and mother, there wasn't a word out of them. And they didn't tell us anything. But we knew in the morning what was wrong. And we were all collected into one room in case the any shots come through the windows or the doors. The stone walls were the safest. And my father had to go to see the cattle, and he was on his way back. And he went and sheltered from a shower. And there was a bullet put through the tree where he was, over his head. Oh my, it was a bad time.
So again, you can sense, as I said there, the emotion in Nora's voice and in her recollection. She's a very thoughtful person, obviously, but it's important to mention as well that Nora's family, you know, Mullins, they were at the time, weren't involved in the Republican movement at all, you know, would have been generally sympathetic but not actively involved, but they experienced it, as you can hear and you can tell from the voice of Nora, who would have been 12 years of age at the time, so, you know, quite well able to recall with great detail the experience and also, as I said, the feeling of that as well. So the next thing I want to mention then is the silence. And, you know, for any oral historian, silence is probably the first thing you should grapple with, because, you know, it presents itself in many subtle ways and different ways, but, you know, unless you understand what's not being spoken about, then it's very hard to understand what is spoken about. And, you know, in lots of cases, people have told me over the years that they didn't talk about the War of Independence, they didn't talk about that. And of course, there are many cases where people didn't, and I'm going to illustrate that now. But obviously, they did talk about it to some people, because we know the tradition is there. So sometimes it's about asking the question and waiting for the answer. But sometimes the silences are going to linger and they're going to overpower the memory. And while we were listening to Nora a little while ago, she talked about the young Murphy boy. And, you know, that is illustrated here. And I've often brought this up at talks because it really illustrates the value of understanding silence and understanding that sometimes something might be too traumatic to even utter out loud. And it brings us back to August 1919 in a place called Glen near Innistimon, and a shot is fired through a window, and a bullet hits the head of a 14-year-old boy, Francie Murphy, and his sister Una comes down the stairs and holds him while he dies. And we can see from the photograph of the Murphy family, and on the top you can see Una and Francie, who happen to be in the photograph side by side. But what I'm going to bring you to is 1965, when Una is dying in a hospital in Innistimon, and when her son, who I interviewed in 2011, is beside her. She's in her second day of a coma. She manages to come out of that coma, grabs the rosary beads from behind her in the bed, and begins to speak. And her son, who I interviewed, recalled very powerfully that first he thought his mother was, you know, going to recover, and he wasn't paying that much attention at the time, but he certainly remembered afterwards, because she sat forward somehow in the bed, or just had adjusted herself slightly. She looked at the foot of the bed, and my interviewee told me he would never believe this if he wasn't there himself, even if one of his siblings had said it, but that she looked at the foot of the bed and said, "Francie, Francie, Francie," lid back down, went back into a coma and passed away the following day. So they were the last 3 words she ever said. And they were the first 3 words ever uttered since the night that Francie was killed 46 years before that in August 1919. So there was an example whereby the experience of her brother being shot, of her holding him as he died, was buried inside in her consciousness, but not too deeply that it didn't come out at that very powerful moment before she passed away. So again, it's important to appreciate that there can be silences that will not be recovered, but in many cases you can find your way through to those memories and unearth them if you do it subtly, and if you do it with great caution and with great sensitivity. They're there to be recovered. One of the big silences, of course, is the experience of women. And it's not a silence really, but it's certainly a gap in our national knowledge. And it has been addressed to a fairly big degree in recent times. But I will make this point, and I've made it publicly before, that, you know, the sort of the discussion around the way in which Conmara were written out of history is not subtle enough in my view, or it's not nuanced enough, because okay, national histories and broader historical representations didn't give anywhere near sufficient recognition to Conmara. But when you go down to local memory, Conmara are there. They're within the memory of local people, and they are within the understanding of local people in terms of their value and their importance within that story. But also, I want to make the point that it's important to broaden out that search for the experience to women of all experiences, because not all women were members of Conmara, but many of them experienced the War of Independence. Some were old women who were in those houses, and 48,000 of them were raided. Some were young girls who experienced that period. There was a lot of sexual violence perpetrated by all sides in many ways across the period that women were affected by. And again, unless we are able to capture all of that experience, then we're missing out on parts of that historical understanding. But obviously Conmara deserve to be recognized. And just a very quick example here is an interview I was doing back in maybe 2010 or so. And I was interviewing Mary Galvin on the top right-hand side there, excuse me, about her father, Michael Foley, who was an IRA man, very active man. She had great tradition on him and spoke a lot about that. He met her mother while he was on the run, as you can see in the top left-hand photograph there, while he was on the run down near Limerick. And they fell in love, they got married during the Civil War, and they had a family together. But when I asked after, or towards the end of that interview, I asked about her mother and her mother's activism. She said that, well, she was in Conmara, but she wasn't really that active. and that she, you know, was involved in, you know, got a medal and etc., but didn't think she was that particularly active. But subsequent to the interview, a discussion moved around to a collection of documents that her mother had left behind and that had been passed into a cousin in Limerick some 40 years prior to that. I went away home. I said I'd be very interested in those documents if they ever turned up. So the following day, her son, who was a detective in the Gardaí, contacted me and said that he had been ordered that night after I left about 9:30. He was ordered to get into Limerick straight away, into the cousin. The cousin was ordered up to the attic. The box was found and brought back down, brought back to Innis. And her son rang me the following day, Noel, and he told me he had brought the box back. So he said, you better come over. So I came over after my day's work and I took the box. They were kind enough to let me take it away to another office I had. And I spent 4 hours copying them out before I started exploring them. And it turned out those documents revealed that her mother was one of the most active members of Conmara in East Clare, only second from the top of the East Clare Brigade of Conmara, was involved in all of the activity you would expect a senior Conmara figure, from the movement of arms. This is her military pass that she used to get in and out of Limerick City with guns under her horse and car to be passed on to IRA volunteers. She took wounded IRA volunteers away and looked after them. But all of that had become enclosed in silence when she became a mother. And it was funny, at the end of her military service pensions file, and I had all the written documents around that from the collection. She said that she didn't participate in the end of it because her child was born. And her child, of course, was Mary, who I showed you there a little while ago. And it was remarkable to see Mary find this revelation about her mother, you know, in her 91st year. She found out about all the revolutionary activities of her mother. So again, memory comes to us in different ways. I just want to, again, on this, for these next couple of slides, just briefly speak about some of the different memory triggers. You know, again, forgive the pun there, but the different things, the different items, the different elements that can conjure up and can trigger and can evoke memories of this time, and sometimes can play a really important role in actually perpetuating the memory or certain memories of that time. And they can be the most obvious one of the guns. And I have a personal story in relation to that, because when I was about 9 years of age, some of the people who might know me will probably be aware of this, but when I was about 9 years of age, I used to be going into old houses and collecting bottles. And, you know, a lot of us are like that, who are historians, think we're half mad in terms of going into houses and stuff, or in terms of picking up old things. But I was inside in a very derelict corner of a house, no roof, no nothing, just a couple of corners of a wall, and grass overgrown throughout it. But I found a handgun, which dated, I know, clearly from the War of Independence now, and I ran up home with it and I looked after it. It was in my little home museum for a number of years, and devastatingly, either my brother, who's now in New Zealand and who'll never tell me if he did anyway, or other visitors to the area took it and it was gone. So it has become really important in the context of the way in which these fragments of memory can be literally on the ground, as I mentioned earlier on, within our townlands or our villages or our landscape generally. And it illustrates how it's there. It illustrates how a war with this global significance, you know, De Valera's over in America, he's trying to get recognition from the President of the United States at the same time that a gun is being secreted in the ground or in a house in my townland or in the townlands all over the country. The ring made in Ballykendler and Thurman Camp that you see in front of you, you know, became a really important symbol for one family for their connection to the War of Independence. Some people, it's directly linked to their farm. You know, in the case of John O'Connell here from Labashida, who told me many, many times about a dugout that had been in his land and that he wanted to go out and show it to me. And on one of the many trips I made to him back in Labashida, he took me out and I just took that photo of him heading out, and he had a great purpose that day because he was going to the point of the landscape that was most significant to him in terms of his connection to the revolutionary period. His uncle was involved, later became a Free State soldier, and the dugout is gone. It was now just a part of the land, but he was able to bring me to the spot where that dugout was, which sheltered Ira in the past on his land, and he was really, really proud of that. But again, it's that connection between place, history, and memory that comes to life in these instances. This is another dugout that was discovered during my research, and worked with the owner to do a bit of work around it. So that's literally taken from under the ground within the dugout as well. And there are multiple ways, too many to mention tonight on a Zoom lecture, but they go from the humorous, there are many humor finds its way into the worst situations, but there are many examples of humorous stories being told that perpetuate memory, and they help us retain facts and information within the stories of that time. But also the supernatural is there, and this is an example of an illustration from 1938 from the school's folklore scheme of an apparent military ghost, and again that would be right across the country. That is, reminiscent of different experiences whereby there's a belief in some supernatural connection to the revolutionary period, be it Black and Tan or a volunteer or whatever it might be. But again, irrespective of the validity of it, it helps retain the memory. And even bringing the humor and the supernatural together. I know in my own case, my father was from a place called Broadford. Well, no, he wasn't. Jesus, no. He was from O'Callaghan's Mills, but Broadford is right beside it. And the Glenwood Ambush was a really significant ambush in January 1921, but there were 6 members of the British forces killed. There had been some talk about a Black and Tan ghost in Glenwood. Now, my father was convinced that he was being told to a local guard from West Cork just to frighten him. But the same guard arrived in the 1950s into a public house in Broadford, didn't drink at all himself. He arrived into the public house, frightened out of his wits, because he was convinced, having cycled through Glenwood, that the ghost of a Black and Tan had been grappling with his legs and trying to pull him off of the bike. Now again, whether there was a Black and Tan ghost, I don't have that power to verify that, but certainly the story, whether it was fellas playing a trick on him, or whether it was a belief, or whether it was true, it keeps the story and the place and the Glenwood Ambush alive within the local community memory in that context. A really good example, I believe, here, in 2009, I interviewed the man in front of you there, Micheál O'Connell, fantastic, again, bearer of history and tradition. But within the interview, he talked about how he described a tan that was buried above in the mountain. Now, this was at the back of Moy, North Clare, and he was adamant that there was a Black and Tan buried above in the bog in the mountain. Now, this is 2009, remember. And he said that over the years that people had, known the story, and that some people hadn't believed it, but, certainly the story was there, it was very strong, and that, even, for example, there had been a fire in the bog area where the Black and Tan was apparently buried, but that everything burned apart from that spot, etc. I was subsequently brought up to the spot, and it was very evident that there was a mound and there was some type of a burial there. It transpired that it was a British soldier from the 2nd Royal Scots, George Duff Chalmers. Pádraig O'Rourke did a lot of work on it as well, in fairness, and discovered the name, etc. But in 2018, the OPW and the British Commonwealth Graves Association, etc., came and exhumed Duff Chalmers and brought him to Grange Gorman, where he's buried now, which of course was a good thing. But probably I always take the opportunity to get certain points across, but the way it was done was wrong in my view, because the local farmer, who had taken great care of the gravesite over many years, not out of the sense of being, pro-British or in any way overly sympathetic, but being human and understanding that there was a young man buried in the ground there. The local memory, the local connection was enough to ensure that the spot was always preserved in some way. But unfortunately, the way in which the officialdom went in without telling the farmer, or just went up through his land, etc., wasn't right, and it missed the point of the local connection to it, and it missed that really dramatically in my view, because officialdom had lost Private Duff Chalmers. There's no question about that. The British records had lost him, the Irish records had lost him. There was no knowledge of where he was. The only place it was preserved was within the local memory of that place, and the attention that local people placed on that memory. And Micheál played a really important role. Unfortunately, Micheál has since passed away, but it is, I think, a very important validation of local memory, and the way in which it can retain aspects of our past that are lost to other records. Okay, just very briefly, before I come towards the end of the lecture, Marcus mentioned earlier there about the Scariff Martyrs book that I'm bringing out in September. 4 young men murdered on the bridge of Killaloe by British forces, a story that has an awful lot involved in it in terms of local memory. I'm not going to go into it now, but just the 2 people at either side, because they were really important in the context of my experience and opportunities. In 2008, I interviewed Margaret Hoey on the left-hand side there, and she was 16 years of age when that happened. So, again, quite well able to recall it, and, was able to give really great detail on the men, 3 of them who she knew personally, the day that the news came to her door, and was incredibly emotional about it, when she recalled it to me, and really gave me a great sense of the impact on the people in the local area for 4 young men to be killed, from their area was really significant. And Paddy Gleason on the right-hand side equally was at the funeral and remembered as well. Both of them passed away at the age of, well, Margaret was 105 and Paddy was 106 when they died. Both, as I said, drew me right back to that experience during that time. And again, I've mentioned John Fahey already tonight. John from Killaloe would have a very great connection to that in terms of even his mother, who would have walked across the bridge the following day after they were shot and saw the blood on the bridge that following day. So those connections are right across the area. The local and the national is in conversation all the time in the War of Independence, and it's very well illustrated after that incident, because Conor Clune, who many of you will have heard of, left East Clare immediately after the funeral and went to Dublin with Edward MacLysett, who you see on the left-hand side. And I think my nephew, Dara Magline, is there. He's doing a project on Edward MacLysett, and I'm under pressure to give him a bit of information, which I promise you, Dara, I will. But that's Edward MacLysett on the left-hand side, and it's a really poignant photo, because Edward travelled to Dublin with Conor Clune that day. They had worked together in building up a new Gaeltacht in Toongrany, and had great success in it, and ironically were only defeated by the War of Independence, because his estate, MacLysett's estate, was raided 28 times, probably with good reason, because he had about 20 IRA men on his staff at the time, but it certainly was a very difficult time for him financially as well as everything else, but none more so than the death of his great friend Conor Clune. Now, Conor wasn't a member of the IRA, even though he's often referred to, because he went up to Dublin, and of course this is the weekend of Bloody Sunday. He's arrested in Vaughan's Hotel. The F Company, the auxiliaries, take him to be another IRA figure. He's brought to Dublin Castle, where 2 men called Peadar Clancy and Dick McKee are already there. They are both very active senior IRA men in Dublin. And the following day, of course, the elimination of the Cairo gang by Michael Collins' squad takes place, and subsequently Bloody Sunday takes place. And then after that, unfortunately, Conor, Peadar and Dick McKee are tortured and murdered in Dublin Castle. The photograph on the left is of Edward MacLysett when he is unveiling a plaque to Conor in 1970, 50 years later. And, he always carried that memory of Conor with him. I've interviewed Edward's son, and certainly it had a very deep impact on Edward MacLysett. MacLysett, for those of you who aren't aware, was a very famous historian and genealogist, Chief Herald of Ireland for a time as well, and an immense figure in Irish history, excuse me, as well. So a couple of brief things to finish up with. This is a very, very traumatic photograph in many ways, but it is of the 2 Lucknan brothers in Shenaglis in Galway, and it's a story again that's often told, but I'm just going to turn on the slideshow for a second to illustrate it again. But that's Pat and Harry Lucknan, who on the 28th of November 1920 were taken from their home by British forces. And, you know, without going into the detail, they suffered, I think, the worst and most barbaric treatment that I've encountered in the revolutionary period. And that's, you know, the Scariff martyrs were tortured and were badly, badly murdered. But the Lucknan brothers, I've never encountered anything like it. And the point I want to make in terms of even memory, you know, and even with the deep understanding we have of the violence of that time, both by, you know, the IRA and the British forces, I don't think it would be believed unless we had the photograph that we have of the Lucknan brothers in the coffins. So, you know, the photograph in that context really brings to life the absolute brutality of that time, and, you know, the emotion and the experience of it. And as in all photographs, there's so many different layers, because I think if you look at the men in the photograph, you see more than even looking at the bodies as well in terms of the trauma of that time. So the landscape of memory is something we have to try and understand. We have to understand as well that the landscape memory is also, you know, a platform for the battle, for the narrative when we go across the generations. And I'll finish up by coming towards the end with just some discussion, brief discussion on what is affected and where has the battle for the narrative kind of fallen over the years. The Civil War, of course, which I have managed to get through about 55 minutes of a lecture without mentioning, is one of the big mediation points for the memory of the War of Independence, because, you know, we know how divisive it was, how divisive it probably still is, and we'll see that in the next couple of years. But, you know, it was such a traumatic experience for the country and for the individuals who were involved, that it has to play out in terms of the way we look at what happened before the Civil War. But the illustration I just want to mention here is the lady on the left-hand side there is Maid Dollig from Kerry, and the man on the right-hand side is her brother Charlie. But Charlie was executed by the Free State in the Civil War up in Drumbo in Donegal. But when I was listening to a tape of Maid Dollig, she talked about the Civil War and how her home in Kerry continued to be a Republican anti-treaty house, and had IRA men staying there often, and the Free State forces raiding it on one occasion. And what I thought was really powerful, even though Unchin McOwen, who did the recording, didn't mention it in his book, but she recalls at one stage that during the raid, when there was shots being fired outside, she knew that there were IRA men on the land in a dugout, and she was inside praying to her brother Charlie, who at that point had been executed, that the other boys wouldn't be found. And for me, it was a very poignant moment. She also mentions that, you know, on the dugout, or where the dugout was, a tree subsequently grew over the decades that followed. And as she said, that's a sacred tree now, because that's where Charlie used to sleep when he was at home for safety. So the Civil War is such a deep impact for all people. And I'm not one of those people who always says, you know, for all sides, because I think that's just a cop-out. But at the same time, you have to recognize the human experience of all sides in these scenarios. And there's no question that, you know, both sides suffered in the Civil War, and ultimately the whole country suffered in a lot of ways. This is a painting drawn by Grace Gifford, of course, the wife of Joseph Mary Plunkett, and it was given to Nan Hogan. Both of them were in jail together. You can't see it, but the pane of glass on the painting was actually a window pane taken from the cell they were in. Nan Hogan was a remarkable woman and a member of Conmara from Clare, who died very soon after being released from jail in 1924. But again, it's just an illustration of the Civil War. Grace Gifford was in jail herself at the time, even though she was the widow of a 1916 leader. When we move through the decades, and I'm coming towards the end now, I can't see Marcus, but I'm sure he's watching the time. But no, look, last couple. Thanks, Marcus. We'll just run through the last couple of slides and have a couple of pieces of audio then, Marcus. But I do want to make the point that right across the decades, when I mentioned this battle for the narrative thing, you know, it affects the memory in different ways, but quite clearly there's a political dimension to it, because in the 1940s particularly, we see a real increase in the memorialization. We see public monuments being installed at a greater rate. We see certainly the Republican movement and Sinn Féin in the 1940s become active all around the country in erecting monuments to the War of Independence. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But just to bring that to light, in 1941, the 25th anniversary of the Easter Rising took place. We're seeing a photograph of it there. Big affair in Dublin. The statue on the right-hand side was commissioned. Oliver Shepherd, the artist, was commissioned to create the death of Cuchulainn as symbolic of the Easter Rising. So that's happening in 1940 and 1941. The 1916 Rising Medal is created, given to veterans of the Rising. A year later, the 1970-21 Service Medal is issued. And at the same time, then you have an ongoing active Republican movement, because at the same time, 1,000 men are in the Curragh internment camp as Republicans or as members of the IRA. There's a really powerful illustration of that in Arbor Hill, when the state have a commemoration at Arbor Hill for Joseph Mary Plunkett. And inside in the prison next door is Jack Plunkett, his brother, who's on hunger strike at the same time. So there's this dynamic is happening all the time. And of course, the state and the government have, we can't disregard its sincerity in terms of its connection to the War of Independence. But there's also this conflict and tension between others who see themselves as heirs to the Republican tradition, and particularly in the 40s, when you have this ongoing activism of some people who were active in the 20s are still active in the 40s, and now they're jailed, like Jack Plunkett as that example. But right across, so the follow through with this is the 40s sees an increased period of memorialization. We see monuments being installed by the Republican movement, we'll call it broadly. But we see a reaction to that then when more, we'll call state orientated groupings who might be Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, more so Fianna Fáil, become active and start memorializing their former comrades in greater numbers as well. And that's definitely a tension. That's definitely kind of almost a polarization. But what's happening for the general public is that the general public who are somewhat disconnected to the politics, or for those who are not connected to the politics, they're seeing more talk, they're seeing more commemoration, they're hearing more songs to the War of Independence. So you're seeing this broader development of a consciousness and a connection to the War of Independence, and particularly to the local connections to that War of Independence. Throughout that whole period from 1926, George Dewhurst brings out the first film, Irish Destiny, in cinemas. And cinemas are becoming really, really popular in the 20s and 30s. John Ford's The Informer, all of those films are playing a big role in bringing about a great consciousness and connection to the War of Independence right across the country, irrespective of people's views on it. Dorothy McCardle brings out The Irish Republic in 1937. Tom Barry brings out Guerrilla Days in Ireland. These are really important narratives for the War of Independence. Yes, they're subjective. Yes, they're somewhat sanitized, but at the same time, they're bringing out a general connection with the general public to the period. The photograph in the middle, is of IRA activists. We know the Men of the South, undertaken in Dublin in 1921, but that image is circulated, that image is projected across the country and creates a certain version of the War of Independence. And I bring that up because, of course, there are books that are, maybe we'd call them hagiographical, but would certainly be presenting, as those films presented, a very disciplined Republican movement and a very ill-disciplined British movement. Now, that rings true in many cases, but of course, we know that there are other aspects and there are nuances. But what I want to say is that a lot of historians, I don't know, Marcus, you'll agree with this, but a lot of historians kind of present this sort of notion of the nostalgic view of the War of Independence. And they present it as almost like it is a fact that all the people across the country need to be educated on the fact that it wasn't a romantic experience. I've not met many people in the hundreds and hundreds of people I've interviewed that didn't understand the level of violence, the level of brutality, the level of nastiness that took place, the level of corruption, the level of malevolence that took place all across the country. And they were able to recognize it in their own people. And they knew it happened. They knew that in any violent situation that you're going to have, people who take advantage of that, people who go too far, etc. And I've seen that nuance is very much alive within the local memory. So I do reject that kind of notion or proposition from some historians that, you know, there's this nostalgic understanding and it needs to be tackled. I don't think that apart from, you know, the broader narratives that we're seeing, I don't think that's the case at all. So look, the last two things I'm going to play out here on is Dan Gleason from North Tipperary, again from the Military Archives, from the Untitled collection. And Dan is just reflecting on 1920. He's reflecting on the period, you know, that he was involved in as a young man himself. He remained involved for many years and decades afterwards. But he does very well, I think, give a quick summary of what life was like at that time. So we'll play that piece, and then I have one more piece of audio to finish up with.
Well, I will say this in all fairness now, like, during 1920, I'd say, all along that period in the winter period of 1920, there was hardly a night but we were out.
Yeah.
Block and row with all kinds of activity.
Very active, yeah.
It was nearly full time. You got home and you tried to have a wink of sleep and you had tried to do something. But that was the story, like, with the tan war.
Yeah.
And I have this to say, like, that all the fellas that I came in contact with, I pay them great tribute, because with very few exceptions, they didn't know what fear was.
Yeah.
You know, the equipment and the kind of an enemy they were dealing with.
Yeah.
I'd say this now in all sincerity, that they all believed that there was nothing if it was victory and nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
And that we were winning and going to win. There was no other way, like.
Yeah.
There was no despondency.
Yeah.
And when someone was killed, well, it was a sacrifice, of course, but you didn't know. We must go on, put more determination to go on with the struggle and to win.
So that's Dan Gleason, as I say, who's given a very good reflection there, I think, in terms of the determination of many of the activists of that time. And the final piece of audio I'm going to play for you is from, excuse me, now just I get it up. Yeah, from a man called Jimmy Gleason. Just bear with me. Okay, so Jimmy Gleason is from Coor in West Clare, and that's Jimmy when he was a young man in the American Army himself, and a couple of years ago before he passed away then as well. Jimmy's father, Ned, was in the IRA. He had a very kind of rounded understanding of that time. You know, he witnessed it all in the context of the memory, because they ran a public house in West Clare and Coor, very famous traditional music spot. And, you know, he heard all the stories, he heard all the jokes. You know, he had told one great story about a man who I remember him telling me, he wasn't sure whether the man was telling the truth or not, but the man's name was Paco Kern, and Paco was actually a very, very active IRA man. Had been in the Glenwood Ambush and, you know, had really been one of the most active IRA men. But funnily enough, for an active man, he was doing a lot of talking, because many decades later, he was in the public house in Gleason's, and he was, as Jimmy said, he was well into his cups, meaning he was drunk. And he started to stand up and tell the stories, you know, about his time fighting the British. And as Jimmy said, he had the chest out, and he was, you know, he was telling them about how many black and tans he took out, etc. And he said there was a young fella there, and to be rare enough a young man would intervene in such a setting. But the young fella, I suppose, was drinking himself. And at one point anyway, in the middle of Paco waxing lyrical about fighting the British, the young fella interjected and said, Jesus, where were you in 1014 when Brian Boru needed you? And Paco turned around and said, Jesus, boy, I was there too. So he had the response ready for him. But Jimmy was watching all of this constantly. Every night there'd be some story about the period, and a lot of them were very sincere disclosures, others were just humorous like that. But when I asked him to characterize the IRA from his experience of, you know, his own father and the men he got to know, he gave me, I think, a lovely rounded assessment, which I think is useful before I just finish it up. Okay, so we'll play that now. Oh, sorry. Bear with me.
They were, outside of my father now, in general, they were a tough race of people. And I have done a fair bit of travelling in my time. And I would say they were a unique race of people. They were tough. They could go for a long time. How would you say it, without food and stuff, and they didn't expect too much. And I would say one thing from, there's a body of men there in a photograph in a parade. I would like to have them behind me if I was in a tight corner. They weren't afraid of anything. And on top of that, too, they weren't maybe the nicest people in the world to their wives and families. They were kind of born wild, if you like. But they were harming, real harming. I remember going to fairs with him in Milltown, like, you know. It was damn seldom you came out of a fair without a row. And they didn't go back from anybody.
Did you ever see your own father in a row at a fair?
Oh, yes, I saw him a few times in action. And they could handle themselves, let's put it that way.
Did he maintain his kind of Republican beliefs? You know?
Right to the last. Right to the last.
So, as I say, that was Jimmy. And I think, again, he gave a good rounded assessment, even accepting the fact that, you know, a lot of IRA men, in terms of their you know, disposition, I suppose, maybe some of them being a bit wild might be maybe a prerequisite in some cases. But, you know, he recognized all the different qualities. And, I mean, that level of nuance and understanding is there. And I think we have to embrace that because, you know, there's so much within any experience like that. And when we break it down to the War of Independence and all of the different elements that are involved in terms of the experience of that time and the way it plays out within the landscape of memory, the multiple ways that it comes to us, the multiple interpretations, the relationship with that past, you know, is all very, very deep. But we can understand it. But in my view, again, we can't understand it unless we engage with the memory and the tradition that is there. And, you know, we have to be on the ground and speaking to people and listening, more importantly, to people in fairly great numbers in order to bring about some sense of understanding. As I say, that's still my quest, is to try and understand it. I know from listening to all of those people and many, many more, I understand it a lot better than I did, you know, when I started out. So look, hopefully, you know, all of that gives some sense of the memory, the value of memory when we're talking about the War of Independence. And look, I do hope you all enjoyed it and that you got something from it. And I'm happy to, Marcus, if there's any questions or anything like that, I'd be very happy to make up an answer.
Jesus, Thomas, that was fantastic. So it was. I mean, everybody riveted in terms of, like, we've over 100 people here. You would have had more if it wasn't for the other link that we created. But let me just go through some of this for you, because I want to ask you this. I find that when somebody who has had the experience of that period passes, it's like a library kind of burning down. What did you find to be the most interesting, or maybe one that particularly stands out in terms of a story that you would have recorded?
I'm asked that an awful lot, and it's difficult. It's really difficult to give a definitive answer to that, because sometimes it's a moment, you know, that's within a memory, and you know, it can be sometimes this disclosure. You know, when Margaret Hoey, the lady I mentioned earlier, was 105 when she passed away. When I interviewed her, only 2 weeks before she died, she had been 80 years away from her parish. It was over 90 years since she experienced it, but she took me to the moment that the news came back to Scariff that the 4 lads had been killed in Killaloo. It was the following day, and an IRA volunteer came to her door. And when she began to tell me that, or you know, offer me that recollection, she started to cry. Now, that was a 105-year-old woman in front of me crying, and she was recalling crying at the time because she said that when the IRA men came to her door and told her mother what had happened, they wanted to tell other IRA men who were in a safe house close by what had happened. And Margaret was, as she said, dispatched. And she said, as she was making her way up along the avenue to the safe house, she was bawling, crying because she knew the lads. And that's the way she said it, for I knew them. And when she got to the door, she described to me how she knocked on the door and the man of the house came out and she couldn't talk, you know. And again, remember that when she's telling me this, she's crying, you know, so I'm getting a real example of the emotion right in front of me. So she's remembering crying. She's crying while she's remembering. And she said that the man of the house shouted at her because, of course, he knew there was something seriously wrong and he wanted to know. And she eventually got the words out that the lads had been killed. And they would have been three men very well known in the area and very well liked in the area, the three IRA men and Michael Egan, the other man as well. But for me, that kind of was a really powerful disclosure because of the emotion that it brought. And it took me closer to that time than any historical information I'd encountered in any other place. You know, there wasn't a sort of a qualitative piece of information that added to the historical knowledge, but in terms of bringing you to the actual experience of the War of Independence for a 15, 16-year-old girl at the time, that took me as close as anything has ever taken me.
Yeah, John Fahy has mentioned, totally agree about Nora, the more personal accounts you read, the more you learn, the more you can connect the dots.
Oh, yeah,
hello there, yes.
Yeah, no, I was just reading out your comment there, John, about, you know,
could I have a minute? If a minute to spare, I want to lay you.
Go ahead, John.
Okay, yeah, okay, if you just be quick, yeah.
Cormac, Eamon de Valera, Professor Wonderly, his son, Professor Eamon, was a famous gynecologist. He died some years ago, but we didn't tell him for a long time. He delivered my 4 daughters. And when he heard it, he said to my eldest daughter, oh, come into my house. And he made coffee and he was talking, and the words he said, oh, Claire, he said, poor dad. But what I wanted to tell you was this lady here, she was the last girl. And when I rang getting through to Michael Brennan, a daughter came on, she said, I'm Dr. Miriam Brennan. And I said, you were an assistant, weren't you, to Dr. Dev? Yeah, she said, I more or less helped him to deliver your daughters. So this is the last one. Dr. Raymond Dev and Dr. Miriam.
I think he actually delivered my mother as well, but that's another story. He delivered her as well as us 4 girls. But thanks so much, guys. We absolutely loved
no
it.
Problem.
It was riveting.
I'll just mute us again.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks.
I'll just read out everybody else's comments there. Lemur Sortel, God, that's devastating about some of the stories that you were reading today. Sean Ojedic, is there any evidence that the Ogsies were particularly more vicious than the Black and Tans? My research would indicate that they were, and indeed we're under instructions to be so.
Yeah, well, the evidence would be like in their effectiveness, and the auxiliaries were officers, as we know, the Black and Tans were servicemen. I mean, the reality is that the auxiliaries were far better trained soldiers. They were very vicious in terms of the evidence we have, obviously. But the real difference was that they were better trained, better equipped, and slightly more disciplined. And therefore, in the context of a mobile strike force, were far more effective. Now, they also came in later into the war, so there was a lot more knowledge at their disposal than, for example, when the Black and Tans came in originally, so in March 1920. So, I mean, without a doubt, they did more damage. There were people within their units that were fairly sadistic, you know, but they were in the Black and Tans and RIC too. But we just know from some of the events, like their role in the Lucknan Brothers, their role in Dick McGee, Peter Clancy, Conor Clune, their role in the Scariff Martyrs, they did an awful lot of damage. But I think what's really important there from the point of view of military, you know, difference, they were officers, and obviously, you know, they had, for that reason, much more experience and much more ability to be effective in that type of a conflict.
Okay. Eddie McBride, when you hear actual stories of people's experiences and memories, it's our duty to never forget what has gone before, and it is almost impossible to forget. Let's see. I sometimes find that sometimes you get the really juicy stories off camera. Has that ever happened to you?
Oh yeah, all the time. Beforehand or after, yeah, that definitely does happen. I think you build up a skill, hopefully, of trying to bring it back onto the recording.
You find out a bit of affairs and love triangles and everything.
Yeah, that's for sure. That always happens. But
one or two other comments. May Moran, I think there's lots of evidence auxiliaries were involved in vicious attacks, but they are noted for commandeering the best hotel rooms. Anything they wanted in shops, best meals in restaurants, even demanded meals in houses around the country where food for the household was in short supply. Brian, great talk, great information. Conor Kearney, has any Auxies or Black and Tans wrote any honest accounts worth reading, do you think? Or
Leslie Shiner's account is good. I think that's worth a look for sure. That gives a fairly honest appraisal of that experience in both in Cork and in Clare and Tipperary as well. So I think Leslie Shiner's would be good. But I mean, there are plenty of accounts. I mean, there was plenty of Black and Tans and British Army officers who stayed in Ireland afterwards, and often gave very fair accounts. Robbie Roberts in North Clare left a statement after him, and many of them were quite well able to stand back and give a fair account of their experience. And to be fair, you see, like, it was less personal for the auxiliaries or the Black and Tans, and it doesn't feature that strongly in terms of British military, because there are so many military escapades in Britain's history that what the Black and Tans did or what the auxiliaries did in Ireland doesn't really feature in their broader story. There's different reasons for that, obviously, but themselves, many of them went on to Palestine afterwards, etc. And the Irish thing for them was part of a broader experience. It wasn't really as big as it was for us, if that makes sense. But there are some good accounts there for sure that are worth looking at.
Sure. Dan Sands has said, should students of history be better equipped academically to engage in memory and research? And should more emphasis be placed on differences between memory, selective memory, remembering things differently, misremembering, lying about the past, etc. in academia?
Yes, would be the answer. And I've worked on this for a long time, and I know, again, I'll just mention Stephen, if he doesn't mind, mention Stephen McCone again. We've worked on that together on it as well, because in my view, it should be the primary thing, and particularly local memory, Marcus, because if you're trying to engage young people in history, and I mean, I think it's a disgrace the way history has been downgraded in the curriculum in recent years. But if you're trying to engage young people, you engage them with what they can see, and they can see their local history, they can see their local places and the historical significance of it. And if you form a relationship between them and their local place and their past, then you can build that outwards into an exploration of the past and all of the things that are mentioned here in the context of the skills that are required to explore that past. But you have to first form a relationship between the people and the past. You can't do that if you're talking about some abstract notion in France or America or wherever it is. Talk about what they're passing every day, because it's there. Our whole landscape is writ large with history, not just about the War of Independence, but about history generally. It's right there in front of them. Illuminate it, draw the connection with it, and then use that to maintain that connection.
One thing I do want to say that you just mentioned about that, I've mentioned in a private message to Stephen earlier, but Stephen McGowan was absolutely incredible in terms of getting schools to take pride in where they came from in 2016, in terms of the 1916 relatives events, learning about the Bureau of Military History. He was fantastic in it, and everybody said so. And one thing that I want to say, if you don't mind me just giving an opinion on that question, Thomas, is that I interviewed Tim Pat Coogan, and he was talking about academic historians wondering what Vinnie Byrne did. Tim Pat Coogan said, if Vinnie Byrne lives down the street, sure, I'll knock on his door and ask him. Do you know? An academic historian sometimes just would not do that. So Eddie McBride has said that would be interesting. Sean O'Jedig, I read the Strickland report in the Kew Archives in London. He thinks there's a cover up there about what happened on the night Cork was burned to the ground. You've done research in this. Would you agree or disagree? Or
yeah, of course. And again, with all reprisals, I mean, it's fairly obvious to say. I mean, there's cover-ups all over the country. you know, at that time, this isn't to exonerate anybody, but I mean, you had two forces facing each other, and you know, it got very nasty very, very quickly, and the objective of each force was to destroy the others. And, you know, in terms of the official records left behind, you know, if for example, in the case of the Loughnane brothers, not just moving away from Cork deliberately, but in a general sense, with the Loughnane brothers, you know, after they were captured and while they were lying in a shallow pond, you know, mutilated, the auxiliaries and the broader British forces, including the RIC, raided their mother's house under the pretext that the lads had escaped and they were trying to see were they at the house. Now they knew where they were because they had put them in a shallow pond. And all of the official documentation they left after that supported their position that the men had escaped. And it transpired quite clearly and, you know, without any doubt that what actually happened was they were mutilated and murdered. Yet the official record from them would indicate otherwise. Now I'm exploring the same scenario with the Scariff Martyrs, because in the Scariff Martyrs case, you have the claim that 4 men tried to escape. Now that was trying to escape after being beaten for 8 hours, being on a bridge, handcuffed at 12 o'clock at night. And yet the official record says they tried to escape. The Court of Inquiry says they tried to escape, and it's all supported by the statements of various police and Black and Tans and auxiliaries. So, you know, the official records are really important in terms of getting a sense of what one side puts on a record, but we have to understand the context within which they're written. And they're written within a very violent, very nasty, very personal war. You know, when you're talking about the RIC, you know, county inspectors' reports, for example, you have to understand that, you know, they're being written by people who, in lots of cases, had friends killed by the IRA. You know, so, you know, how do you forge any objectivity out of that experience? You know, so of course, there's in the Strickland report is exactly the same. You know, the nature of that experience leads itself very easily into falsification in official reports, in my view, anyway.
Okay, I'm going to read comments until 10 o'clock, and then we'll just have to call it time. So I was working my way down the comment list. Okay, but you know, we're giving RT a run for the money. Okay. Stephen Brown, the auxiliaries.com website has lots of interesting information, but I appreciate some of the audience may have difficulties about some of the content. As historians, we are duty bound to consider all evidence and interpret. Lemur Sortel had said it was an astounding photo. Kathy had said very interesting, thank you. Deirdre Colligan had said it was a great respect of the dead. Eddie McBride, resistance is not a crime, what England has been responsible for in Ireland. Let's see, Shauna Jadig, agreeing revisionism distorts. Stephen Brown, revisionism is being applied to the Civil War, and I hope there are going to be open debates about that period. I think there will be a Civil War, remembering the Civil War, possibly. What are your thoughts?
Oh, God, it's like the mention, it's a bit early to tell. It's only 100 years. Look, it's going to be very, very interesting. There's no question. I mean, okay, the real, you know, there's been a story and there's been a trajectory in the Civil War. And I think, funnily enough, the emergency was an important healing period because the LDF formation, the LDF brought kind of former enemies together in that force. That was important for the real visceral division. There were communities within communities for decades after the Civil War. And, you know, that discussion was limited to those communities. And when the communities came together, discussion stopped. And there's one of my findings in my research is that there are different levels of memory. There's the private, there's the public, and there's the national, and there's different kind of dynamics going on within all of those levels. But I have an example. In 2011 or 12, I did an interview with a woman in her 90s, and her father had been in the Mount Eye hunger strike in 1917, and he subsequently went on to be in the IRA and in the Free State Army. And lovely woman. She didn't have an awful lot of knowledge about her dad, but she showed me what she did know, and that was fine. But I went back maybe a month later to meet her again, just to follow up with her, and we did chat again, but she was really upset the second time I went back. And the reason was that she had been at her local daycare center, and she had been speaking to a woman previously. And she said when she went back, that the woman ignored her, and that she ignored her in front of her friends, and she was really embarrassed by it and, you know, really upset her. But she was asking, she said it was something to do with my daddy. And she used that word, you know, it's here someone in the 90s describing her daddy. And she said, it was something to do with my daddy. Like, what did he do? Now, I knew her father had been in the Free State, obviously. I knew he'd been down in Kerry, but he was from County Clare. And I also knew that the woman she was talking about was the niece of an IRA man from Mid-Clare who was executed by the Free State in the Civil War. And it was between her first and second meeting that other woman realised that she was the daughter of a Free State officer. And that was enough for her. You know, the upset was still raw enough. The inheritance was there. Even though she was born after, both of them were born after the Civil War, but it was still manifest in a nursing home, you know, in the 2010s between these two old women. And, you know, and that I'm sure is right across the country. There are examples of that. But I do think there'll be more, there'll be tension, there'll be arguments, there'll be, without a doubt, there'll be, you know, differences of opinion. I think, to be honest with you, you know, we should be exploring it. You know, we should commemorate, we should always commemorate. And there are local groups and local people who will best do that. But I think from the point of view of the state and the county council should be supporting exploration, supporting things like you're doing and Liam is doing, Marcus. I don't think the state should be involved in commemorating. I think it should be involved in supporting the broader exploration in conferences, in research, or whatever it might be. I think that's my own view in terms of what the state should be doing rather than maybe imposing a particular view or narrative on it.
Yeah, well, if you can't remember 100 years on, when can you remember it? Do you know what I mean? So you have to do it warts and all at some stage. You nearly owe it justice to do it warts and all, I think. At this stage,
yeah, and that's for sure. I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. And I think that will happen, you know, but I mean, we need to explore all of that. But, excuse me, I think in terms of the state, that's where the difficulty be. The state has a body and what its role is in directing the broader thing. I think they should maybe just support the deeper exploration, like that lady's point about schools and memory and place and all that.
Great point, yeah. Patrick Kilfeather, thank you for a very moving presentation. When I read your book, The Time of the Towns, I described it to a friend with a special interest in the War of Independence. And, what was it? The reality of the savage war inflicted on our people and the terrible toll it took. A lot of people say this about your book, just how moving they were, or how moved they were by reading it, because the personal accounts were just so incredible. Rob Duggan has said it's a great set of first-hand accounts and precious recording treated as sacred memory. Susan Tibbles, thanks very much. Jim Haggerty, let's see. My father was an officer in H Company, Cork number 1. Limo Sortel has asked, is Cahill O'Shannon the interviewer? But I don't know for which interview he's talking about there.
Cahill isn't an interview in any of them. He did great interviews, Cahill did, but he wasn't in any of the ones I played there. It was Unchin McOwen or myself were the only ones I used tonight.
Okay. Eddie McBride, there is no glory in war or death, but is always romanticized. Let's see. Yeah, some relatives have said, like, I mean, it's just awful sometimes. You mentioned at the end of the presentation about how, like, maybe some historians maybe are taking it, maybe nearly lecturing maybe the relatives as to how bad the relative was, I suppose, and they don't have the sense of maybe hindsight or context. You know, it's very, very easy for some academia maybe to have certain opinions, let's say. Shauna Jadig, the myth of the English officer and gentleman needs to be looked at in the context of the shocking behaviour here, and it wasn't all post-World War I trauma. Josephine O'Hagan, thanks Thomas, very interesting account of the War of Independence. Josephine, thank you Thomas, brilliant lecture. Eileen Mulvaney, fascinating lecture, thank you. So good to see the stories of ordinary people included in the story. Limo Sortel, Guru Milamaya, God Thomas, Air Fiaus. Thank you, most informative, Shauna Jadig. Eddie McBride, thanks for sharing personal accounts that adds to the written word. Jared Shannon, Thomas, as you know, the McGowan collection covers a lot of Republican developments in the 1930s and 40s. Did you notice any recurring trends or ideas discussed by the activists active in that period about those decades? An outstanding, engrossing presentation, by the way.
Thanks very much. Look, in terms of the patterns, excuse me, that are there, I mean, you're talking about a cohort of people who maintained a very active Republican position. You know, some of them obviously had been involved in the 20s. You know, you're talking about Sean McBride, Maura Comerford, names that would be very well known nationally, but then you had people who wouldn't be necessarily that well known. So obviously you're talking about a Republican cohort who would have been, you know, somewhat against the state, you know, even at the time still that they were doing the recordings. So, you know, you have to understand that was the whole context of Unchin McOwen's collection. Now, many of them were well capable of reflecting back on, you know, what happened, on the state's position at various times, you know, the chaotic nature of their own movement as well, particularly in the 1940s. But what was really important for me, I think, is that in an awful lot of cases, and it's kind of what I was trying to bring out early on in the lecture, a lot of them were reaching very far back as much as they were coming forward. So they weren't just going back to the 20s. They had parents, grandparents in the, you know, the Fenian movement or the land war, or whatever it might be. So there would be very deep connections and kind of this generational responsibility. And an awful lot of IRA activists in the 40s particularly, you know, I suppose it was very clear they had felt a real strong duty to continue on with their, as they saw it, their legitimate struggle. And, you know, that shouldn't be underestimated. And of course, there's a state there that disagreed with it. There's a state that would say that, you know, that they had to get on with the state they had and try and work towards maybe the development of a 32-country republic. Republicans would argue that the state wasn't sincere in that. So you have two very different positions. But certainly I do find when you listen to people, even though they might have been considered, and it's great testament to the military archives to have taken in that collection, because it wouldn't have been designed for a state repository. You know, it wouldn't, a lot of the men who gave it wouldn't probably have considered it would ever end up in a state repository. But by the military archives taking it in, it sort of infuses a different narrative into the archives of the state. And that's really, really important because, you know, the period we're talking about, the 40s, you know, it's in the emergency, the state is under a lot of pressure, and, you know, there was a lot of viciousness. There was a lot of killing on both sides during that time. But now we have at least the context of that other side, of that other involvement. And people can see that and they make their own judgments on the basis of a big number, 102 people, you know, who were interviewed.
Oh, 100%. I think the military archives.ie website, it nearly democratizes Irish history from the 15-year-old in the school to, like, you know, the person who wants to know about the granddad that's 70 years old. I think it's a fascinating resource. Christina McMullen, fascinating lecture. I could listen to you for hours. Thank you so much. And by the way, Thomas, you've done that yourself. You created your own library yourself, as has Stephen, in terms of like just keeping history alive, keeping memories alive for people that when it could have just passed. A lot of those stories, if you didn't record them, they may not have been remembered. You know what I mean? Like it's incredible what you've done. What I'm going to do, folks, is I'm going to copy and paste every comment and I'm going to send it to Tomás. Okay, but we'll be here all night. Otherwise, it will be 1 o'clock in the morning by the time we finish. I just want to say special thanks to Stephen McCracken, who is in the background handling all the technical support. We had a bit of a scare there, but we managed to pull it off somehow. We did. And well done, Tomás, for working under such pressure. You really, really pulled out all the stops, I have to say. Thank you very much, guys. Another fascinating episode of Trasnet here. Lovely to see you all. Hope to see you again soon. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Marcus. Good night.
Okay.
Thanks a million, Marcus.
No problem. Take care.